Genesis 12 through 50 are a qualitatively different section of material than Genesis 1 through 11. Genesis 1 through 11 is the primeval history. It's where God is dealing with all of humanity all at once. Genesis 12 through 50 is God's taking a different approach. He's no longer going to deal with everybody all at once. He's going to single out one person through whom he's going to work. And in that block of material, from chapter 12 to chapter 50, we have a lot of recurring themes. We have the establishment of covenants. We have the unconditional covenant that's given to Abraham, in which he's promised to have a great name, and he's promised the land, and he's promised offspring. That promise of offspring comes to bring us to another theme in that section, and that is barrenness. All of our three matriarchs, Sarah and Rebecca and Rachel, all dealt with the issue of barrenness. Very often that concluded with a miraculous birth. But the birth is not usually the end of the story. You also end up with strong sibling rivalry between Ishmael and Isaac, between Esau and Jacob. Usually there is an issue of favoritism behind some of that sibling rivalry that you get. Younger sons are typically favored. We see reversals all throughout, where the younger son Isaac is favored, the younger son Jacob is favored. When Jacob blesses Joseph's sons, he reverses the blessing to favor the younger one as well. So that's a recurring theme that you get in there. Now the setting of the patriarchs is the second millennium BC, early in the second millennium, the first half of the second millennium BC. The stories represent a different culture, and sometimes some of the practices can seem a little odd to us. And it's helpful to know that some of these practices existed in the culture surrounding it. The idea of adopting a son to designate an heir, that's a very common tactic. Much of the customs of the patriarchs were reflected in some form in texts that were found at a city called Nuzi. These Nuzi texts showed legal cases where you'd had an individual adopted to become an heir, where you had an individual designated as the firstborn, as Jacob does to Joseph's sons at the end of Genesis. Childless couples using a surrogate was a common practice, as with Hagar, Sarah's handmaiden that she gives to Abraham. Interesting tradition, the possession of household gods helps us understand what is really a kind of unusual passage with Jacob. When Rachel steals her father's household gods, the practice of household gods was one of giving business an honor or notary seal. It was sort of an official kind of power. We see that paralleled within some of the ancient Near Eastern texts as well. Also, many of the religions around this time would have been very fertility-based. Fertility was a very important thing. We're going to talk about that more when we talk about Canaanite religion. But many of the religions of the ancient Near East were fertility religions. And so fertility religions, one of the things that is not uncommon, I won't say it's common, but it's not uncommon in a fertility religion to be aware of human sacrifice. What greater example could you give for a deity dedicated to fertility than an example of fertility, a child? So when Abraham is called upon to sacrifice his son Isaac, something that is a completely foreign idea for us today, that is something that, while he may never expected Yahweh to ask him, he would not be unfamiliar with in the area around. One other interesting sort of historical context note for us in terms of the patriarchs: when Joseph rises to power in ancient Egypt, he gets to the point where he is second in command only to Pharaoh. Now, one of the difficulties with this story is native Egyptians would never have permitted that. In Egypt, they were some of the more bigoted people in the ancient Near East. They did not like the Puttites to their west. They did not like the Cushites to their south. They did not like the Semites to their east. As far as they were concerned, it's Egyptian pride, native Egyptian pride all the way. To believe that Joseph was appointed second in command by native Egyptian Pharaoh, it's to believe that Alabama would elect a black governor in 1950. It just strains credibility. You would never imagine that happening. But interestingly enough, there is this period of time in the early part of the second millennium where a group of foreign invaders actually conquered Egypt. They are often known as the Hyksos, which just means foreign ruler. The Hyksos invaded Egypt. Egypt normally had the best home field advantage in the ancient Near East, but they were conquered a couple of times, and the Hyksos invasion was one of them. And it just so happens that that Hyksos period that we have in Egypt is the time period we would be thinking about as likely for the person of Joseph. So it gets rid of that historical problem to say that these stories are told in a very believable manner. They reflect customs of the time, they reflect customs of the day. And I think understanding a little bit of that context can help us understand a little bit of the story.